Washington Journal continues.
Later this afternoon, a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee will hold a hearing on term limits, and two of the witnesses who will be testifying at that hearing are Casey Burgett, Governance Project Senior Fellow at the R Street Institute, and Nick Tomboulides, Executive Director of U.S. Term Limits. They'll be with us, though, in this final hour of the Washington Journal as we talk about term limits and take your calls on phone lines split up a little bit differently. If you support term limits, you can start calling in now at 202-748-8000. If you oppose term limits for members of Congress, it's 202-748-8001. Nick Tomboulides, as folks are calling in, start us off. What is U.S. term limits, and why and how are you making the case for term limits?
Yeah, well, U.S. Term Limits is a nonprofit organization that fights for term limits at all levels of government, from Congress all the way down to dog catcher. And basically, we are focusing on this issue because the American people are frustrated. American people are fed up with a Congress that falls well short of what a great country like ours deserves. When you poll Americans, 60% of them say they would fire every single member of Congress if they could. Congress has a 14% approval rating and a 98% reelection rate. John, that is a sign of a horribly dysfunctional and broken system. You know, when people run for office in this city, they often call it a swamp. But once they get here, it becomes more like a hot tub. They get comfortable, they start enjoying the perks, the privilege, the power, the prestige, and they never want to go home. They never want to go back and talk to their constituents. And it's become a serious problem. I feel like we have disastrous policies as a result of career politicians running this country. We've got $22 trillion in debt. We've got the longest war in American history, a broken healthcare system, broken immigration system. We've got record levels of dysfunction and hyperpartisanship. And we're never going to solve that problem by doing the same thing over and over again. We need to chart a new course. I think that's why 82% of Americans support term limits. And by the way, this is not a new idea. We have term limits on 36 governors, 15 state legislatures, 9 of the 10 largest cities in America, and number 10, Chicago, is coming soon. Shout out Lori Lightfoot. And of course, the President of the United States has term limits. If term limits are good enough for the leader of the free world, what is so special about Congress that they should be able to serve for life?
Casey Burgett, how do you answer that question?
The presidential question, it's a great one. I'll first start by saying we're in an interesting position because term limits are incredibly popular, and there's, for all those reasons Nick mentioned, why they are. People are fed up with Congress, that it's broken, it doesn't work, it's dysfunctional, it's partisan. All those things are true, but term limits are such a draconian measure that automatically kick out the best among us just to get rid of the worst among us. And I don't know if that's a particularly good investment, particularly when we're talking about Congress, where there's no school for this. Governing is incredibly hard. We run a $4.1 trillion federal budget that if you're sworn in on a Monday, I don't know how effective you are going to be overseeing that on a Tuesday. In terms of the question about the presidential term limits, he does have term limits. That's a new 22nd Amendment that was added on after the original Constitution. And I think Congress is different than the president in that the president is a singular figure. There's no one single member of Congress with anywhere close to the power of the presidency in terms of commander-in-chief running the executive bureaucracies that far outweigh the number of employees in the legislative branch. The president is fundamentally different than members of Congress. Turning to the 98% reelection rates, yeah, we have a lot of members that run for reelection and get reelected, but the point is that they ran for reelection and won. Voters have the ultimate power. When we talk about the 98% reelection rates, that's a little different when you look at people that don't decide to run for reelection. That number goes down, and we have the best case in point with the 2018 midterms when we elected 100 new members of the House and the most diverse in history. So the mechanism is there. We just got to use it.
Nick Tomboulides, a lot of points in there, but to the one that Casey Burgett brings up, that experience matters in policy making. How do you answer that?
Well, I think Ronald Reagan said it best when he said the only experience you get in politics is how to be political. You know, right now we have the most experienced, professionalized, careerist Congress in American history, and the results are a dumpster fire. We're not getting our money's worth out of the career politicians who are running the show now. And I think a big part of it is Congress is not very diverse. You know, a majority of members of Congress are lawyers and professional politicians. How does that qualify you to be an expert on healthcare? How does that qualify you to be an expert on education or banking or so many other issues that Congress is tasked with governing. I think if we went to term limits and we had a citizen legislature, we would get people from all walks of life, real subject matter experts who could come in here and tackle these issues. I also think the constant emphasis on re-election is very corrosive to Congress, because instead of getting policy expertise, instead of actually reading these 1,000-page bills that we hear about all the time on the news, they're busy campaigning. The average congressman spends 5 hours a day in a call center on a telephone begging for money from big donors so that they can get reelected or so that they can pay off their party to get a prime spot on a committee. That's not getting experience. In fact, that's a distraction from your job duty.
And as Casey Burgett points out, when they run for re-election, they usually win. The reelection rate for those members of Congress who ran for re-election in 2018 was 91%. Those numbers from OpenSecrets.org, a website that C-SPAN viewers very familiar with. In the Senate, it's not quite as guaranteed. It was 84% in 2018. Again, you can see the chart there from OpenSecrets.org. U.S. term limits has a pledge that they're hoping that members of Congress sign. We'll show it to viewers. And then the candidate's name, pledge that as a member of Congress, I will co-sponsor and vote for the U.S. term limits amendment of 3 House terms and 2 Senate terms and no longer limit. Why that specific term limit?
Sure. Well, we obviously need term limits because we've got to throw the bums out. The status quo isn't working. With respect to why that is the specific limit we've chosen, you know, the House and the Senate were not originally intended to be the same type of chamber. The House was supposed to be a lot more rough and tumble, a lot more populist, closer to the people. That's why the term is only 2 years. The framers intended for there to be a lot of turnover in the House, so a shorter limit there is more appropriate. The Senate was supposed to be more deliberative, modeled after, say, the House of Lords. So 6 years in the House, 12 years in the Senate, I think is more than enough time to make your mark in Washington, D.C. If you can't get the job done in 18 years, then you have no business running for office in the first place.
Casey Burgett, would term limits drain the swamp?
Absolutely not. And evidence has shown at the state level that it will actually increase deference to people outside the chamber. When you're elected in and you don't know how to run this country, you don't know how to oversee and appropriate such a large government budget across a host of government programs, which I admit a lot of them are broken. If you come in with inexperience, you're going to do what we all do when we don't know what to do. We Google it, and when that doesn't work, we ask someone else for help. And Washington, D.C. is a culture of information sources to help people govern. And those often come with partisan agendas through special interest groups or lobbyist organizations. And so when you don't know what to do, you go and ask these people that you trust or someone that you know trusts. And that comes often with a partisan agenda. So that's why we turn to special interests. So state after state, study after study have shown that deference outside the chamber to special interest groups, to the governor, to the executive, to the federal agencies that implement these laws that Congress has passed, that deference goes up. And that harms the public because bureaucrats are not elected. Members of Congress are.
Those are the cases against and for term limits, and you're going to be hearing more about it today if you tune in to cspan.org around 3:30. The Constitution Subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee will be holding a hearing on this topic, keeping Congress accountable, term limits in the United States Congress. That starts at 3:30. These two gentlemen who are with us this morning will be testifying at that hearing. Of course, you won't be able to ask them questions this afternoon, but you can now. And the phone lines are set up by those who support term limits and those who oppose, and we have plenty of callers already for you. Linda is up first out of Orange, Connecticut, opposes term limits. Why is that, Linda?
2 reasons. Number one, I do admit we have a problem with constantly sending some people who aren't really serving the public back to Congress. But I believe the way to eliminate that is by publicly funded elections. That way we pay for the bill. We reinstate the FAIR Act where they get the equal TV time and they answer to the voters. We get what we pay for. My other reason for not supporting term limits is I happen to have a very good congressperson. She's out at grocery stores. She personally helped me during the mortgage crisis with a bad lender. And she does good work. And I don't know what other profession we would want to send people where we punish them for doing good work.
Linda, who's your member?
Work as a host. Rosa DeLauro. And that lady works. and she works with the people. And you want to call her a professional politician? You can do that. But let me tell you something. She serves the people.
Linda, thanks for the call from Connecticut this morning. Nick Tomboulides, to that point, she doesn't want to throw out her member of Congress.
Yeah, well, if you, Linda, want to keep your member of Congress in power for life, then it sounds like you're not a term limit supporter. And that's okay. You know, we have disagreements on this issue. You probably agree with about 10% of Americans who don't think we need term limits on Congress. But I'll tell you why the 82% of Americans who want term limits support it so much. It's because we want the ability to re-elect our own congressmen for a little while, but we don't want them to become so out of touch that they lose their connection with their constituents. So it's very important to maintain this tie between a member of Congress and their constituents. And by the way, term limits, like I said, not an unusual idea. We already term limit the presidency. There are folks in our country who have a great affinity for either President Obama or President Trump, and yet you don't hear these people saying, let's repeal presidential term limits, because they understand that it's healthy for our republic. And I would suggest that the same is true for Congress. There are definitely some good members of Congress, but I think they are more than outweighed by members of Congress who are responding to the wrong incentives, the incentive to stay in power rather than do what's right.
Casey Burgett, you've got Connor out of Greenbelt, Maryland. Good morning.
Good morning. Yes, I support the idea of term limits. I think that an idea in Congress can be that, you know, why solve a problem when you can just run on the issue indefinitely? But I wonder if both guests could maybe comment on what they think fixing gerrymandering would do to this issue. I've heard Arnold Schwarzenegger talk about steps he took in California, and it seems like those steps helped make seats much more competitive, and it maybe took away the need to have term limits. Thank you.
Absolutely. Connor, great question. And this leads to a point when we talk about what members of Congress do with their time in Washington, D.C. under no term limits. Nick mentioned fundraising, which they do. They dial for dollars all the time. There are other steps that we can take that don't involve the draconian measures of kicking someone like Rosa DeLauro out of office, even though the vast majority of her voters support her. I'm of the belief that if your voters support you, you should, and you're eligible to run for re-election, let them decide. I think that's the best, that's the intention of what our representative democracy is. So if you are mad at money in politics, let's fix money in politics. If you're mad at gerrymandering, let's fix gerrymandering. These are issues that we can fix on an issue-by-issue basis, and we have little evidence to believe that fresh members are more likely to support these things, if for no other reason that they are eligible for re-election until they're not too. So in their first term, their second term, before they're ineligible, they have proven to be more focused on re-election activities, or just as focused on re-election activities such as fundraising, as members of Congress with no term limits. It's only when they reach that time horizon that they become less interested. And studies after studies have shown that that electoral connection, that response to constituents, when that electoral connection is severed, they care less about their constituents' concerns. They're more likely to look at what is next for me. I would like to do more of what I believe is right rather than what my constituents is right, because they don't face the accountability measures that an election provides. So that we should not underappreciate what it means to run for re-election.
Nick Tomboulides.
Well, I think we have congressmen who don't listen to us now as a result of being so invincible at the ballot box. Like I said, 98% of incumbents are reelected every 2 years, but when you dig a little bit deeper, what you realize is that our country actually has an epidemic of uncompetitive elections. Every 2 years for Congress, over 80% of incumbents running for re-election are either totally unopposed or they're underopposed, meaning that they're running for election, but they've got an opponent who's not running a serious campaign, and the incumbents cakewalk back into those districts. Rosa DeLauro was mentioned before. She's a congresswoman in a heavily Democratic district who has not had a primary challenger in 10 years. Again, we've got 10% of congressional elections on average that are unopposed every 2 years. How do you vote your incumbent out when there's nobody else on the ballot? I live in Florida. Before we passed term limits in Florida, we had election cycles in which more than half of all the elections in Florida were just canceled because the incumbents were too powerful and nobody was willing to challenge them. So the power of incumbency has a chilling effect on people who would otherwise run. You talk about money in politics, a big reason for it is that incumbents can raise $9 from PACs for every $1 that a challenger can raise. In theory, we might have elections, but in reality, the deck is stacked and incumbents are doing it.
Casey Burgett, you want to quickly respond?
Absolutely, that's a great point. Increasingly, we have more and more safe seats. 80% of them, the election, for all intents and purposes, takes place in the primary. So if you term limit people out, the logic tells us that if the election happens in the primary, that means you're going to get more and more candidates. We have, what, 22 for the Democratic presidential nomination right now. If it's an open seat and the election takes place in the primary, you have an incentive to run to the extreme of your party to represent that majority Democratic district, right? Which means that if we do this every 6 years for each class, we're going to get 1/3, 80% of that 1/3 to run to the extreme of their party, which does nothing and in fact will exacerbate partisanship, because you're going to send the most extreme candidates that can win their primary to a Congress where they run against Congress and against the other party to represent that district. So it's an interesting point and one we need to study, but totally agree with 80% of safe seats. That's not what was intended, and I think we can do other things besides term limits to lower that number.
Having this conversation until our program ends at 10 a.m. Eastern this morning. Phone lines again. If you support term limits, 202-748-8000. If you oppose term limits, 202-748-8001. Nat's on that line for those who oppose out of Baltimore, Maryland. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for C-SPAN. Whereas I support everything that these two gentlemen are saying, I've dealt with Congress for 50 years, and what I found is that even when the congressman or the senator changes, the staff doesn't. So there's a secondary problem that I wish you people would consider, and that is that with the congressmen should go the staff, because the staff is the real continuity, and we wind up with a very bureaucratic, unimportant congressman with a high continuity, 40 years in some case, of the staff who are connected to the lobbyists. And that is where one of the greatest problems with the congressmen lie.
Nat, thanks for bringing that up. Nick Tomboulides, should there be term limits on congressional staff?
It's certainly something that I would favor, but I don't think it needs to come along for the ride if you're going to do term limits for Congress. This is actually one of the most popular myths out there about term limits, that if you do it, it's somehow going to empower staff. Gallup took a poll and 85% of congressional staff said that they were against term limits. I think that pretty much settles the question right there as to whether they would get more influence. What makes a staffer in Washington more powerful is typically that they work under the protection of a very senior member of Congress. If that member of Congress is termed out or has to retire, the staff will diminish in value. In fact, when California passed term limits, the staff turnover on committees increased by about 50% in the 1990s. And you also have a big problem with staff in the revolving door here in Washington, D.C., where a staffer will leave a senator's office and then go become a lobbyist and lobby their own boss. Term limits would also address that, because if you term limit out the old boss, then you're instantly devaluing that Rolodex when the person goes over to K Street and tries to become a lobbyist. There was one study done on this that found the amount of money that you can earn as a lobbyist on K Street drops by about 25% when your old employer, the senator, retires.
You mentioned the Senate and senior senators. Here's the most senior senators. Patrick Leahy, Democrat from Vermont, began serving in 1975. Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa, 1981. Mitch McConnell, Republican of Kentucky, 1985. Richard Shelby from Alabama, Republican, 87. Patty Murray, out of Washington, a Democrat, 1993 is when she began. Dianne Feinstein, Democrat from California, also began serving in 1993. Casey Burgett, should the staff of those very senior members have some sort of term limit? Absolutely not. The caller said it perfectly when they represent the continuity of government. And I think we're underappreciating how hard it is to actually keep this place open on a day-to-day basis. There's an infinite number of federal programs that are not going to go away when you term limit members or their staffs out. The value of staff often does come from their connections, but it also comes from their expertise that they bring to the issue. Staff, a lot of them at the most senior level, the ones that are high valued on K Street, are valued for their connections, but they're also valued because they know things. They know how they work. They know how to implement law. They are able to predict unintended consequences better than their member, and that's why they're valuable. So if you term limit out their boss,
that knowledge doesn't go away. But if you term limit the staff, that goes somewhere else. And they've proven over and over to more likely go to K Street to use that expertise, because it's not very valuable when you leave this area of government. And I don't know that it should be. But to put term limits on congressional staff just ensures that we lose the capacity of government to function on a day-to-day basis, which we can say that it's broken now, but we're trying to prove a negative here by saying how bad it would be if we did this, and I promise you it would be way worse.
We showed you that list of longest-serving current senators. Here's the longest-serving current representatives. Don Young, the Dean of the House, began serving in 1973. He's a Republican from Alaska, of course. James Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin, a Republican, 1979. Hal Rogers of Kentucky, 1981. Christopher Smith of New Jersey, a Republican, 81. Steny Hoyer, Democrat from Maryland, the current majority leader, 1981 as well. Edward's calling in from Osterville, Massachusetts, supports term limits. Edward, go ahead.
Yes, just a comment. I believe that Mark Twain summed it up properly when he said that politicians and diapers should be changed frequently and for the same reason. Thank you.
Thanks, Edward. We'll get in Patrick from South Dakota this morning. Patrick, go ahead.
Hi. I just had a question for both Nick and Casey. First, my question for Nick is, you seem to offer term limits as this kind of silver bullet for the partisanship and disconnect that Americans feel from their Congress. Why is it specifically term limits that can resolve this problem that Americans feel? And then to Casey, my question is that you mentioned if we do have term limits, then new congresspeople and senators will defer more to outside interests. But isn't the difference in special interests already a problem in the status quo system? And why would term limits make this worse? Thanks.
We'll start in the order of the questions asked.
Yeah, well, we're not actually saying term limits is a silver bullet per se, but it is a huge part of the reform that needs to be done to make Washington work again and to fix this broken system. One reason we're so enthusiastic about term limits is because it has worked very, very well at the state level. There are 15 state legislatures with term limits, and the data show that those states have more competitive elections. They have lower barriers to entry, so more people from all walks of life are able to run for office. We have data on how states are performing in terms of fiscal health, and the states with term limits on average have a better ranking of fiscal health than the states run by career politicians. So, the rookies are not driving these states into the ground. In fact, they're doing a much better job because they know they have a fixed time horizon to get the job done, change the system before it changes them, and then return home to live under the laws that they made.
And Casey Burgett, the question for you was your concern about term limits would make special interests more of a problem. The caller saying special interests already a problem.
Yeah, exactly. We're trying to prove that it will get worse on something that hasn't happened yet at the federal level. And the state level is it's a serious business, but it is not the federal level. It is infinitely bigger and infinitely more hard to do it because you're voting on things that affect Alaska when you're from Maine. It's really hard to anticipate all of these things. So deference comes from information voids. Members of Congress and their staffs are so torn in so many different directions. They're pulled by so many interests, trying to vote on credit default swaps the same day as healthcare, the same day as immigration. These are infinitely complex issues, and when they don't have all the information, they go to somewhere else that has it. And it will get worse under term limits because you are mandating that experience leaves the chamber every 6 years or every 12 years. You're mandating that it leaves, and it gets worse. So that information void, that gap between what you know and what you experience gets bigger and bigger. So then you go to somewhere else, and those are often, they prove over and over again that that's a special interest groups or nonpartisan organizations, but those are getting infinitely harder to find here in D.C.
Yeah, I would submit that members of Congress have so many information voids because they're campaigning all the time. Studies show us that instead of actually doing their jobs, these people are basically raising money and on the campaign trail about 70% of the time. Mm-hmm. Maybe if we had term limits and they were more focused on the business at hand, they personally would have the time to read the bills, and the special interests that infect the system right now wouldn't be able to do so. I will tell you one thing about lobbyists. We have run hundreds of term limits campaigns all over the country, every level of government, city, county, state, you name it. And in every single one of those campaigns, the lobbyists and the special interests that they represent contribute exclusively to whichever side is trying to prevent, weaken, or abolish term limits. Mm-hmm. So if you follow the money, you see lobbyists are no fans of term limits. They don't like when term limits sever their relationships they have with incumbents. Jack Abramoff even said as much. He said a politician who stays in office for life and is a friend is worth his weight in gold to a lobbyist.
It's just after 9:30 on the East Coast, having a conversation about term limits this morning with two gentlemen who will be testifying about term limits later today at a Senate Judiciary Subcommittee hearing. It's the Constitution Subcommittee. It's meeting at 3:30 this afternoon. You'll see these two men there, and you can watch it streaming live at cspan.org. That's where we'll be showing it. Casey Burgett is with the R Street Institute, a senior fellow in their governance project there. Nick Tomboulides is Executive Director of U.S. Term Limits. And Nick Tomboulides, take us back to 1995 and U.S. Term Limits v. Thornton. What was that case about?
Sure. So what happened in the early 1990s was voters in 23 states passed initiatives at the ballot box to term limit their members of Congress. So if you lived in Florida, where I live now, you would have gone into the ballot box, said yes, it passed with 77% of the vote, and you amended the Florida Constitution to say that now Florida's congressional delegation has term limits. 22 other states did the same. Sometimes they were state amendments, sometimes there were state statutes. That was appealed up to the Supreme Court, and in 1995, in the split decision, U.S. Term Limits v. Thornton, the Supreme Court ruled that those state-imposed term limits were unconstitutional. So for term limits on Congress to happen, it has to be an amendment to the federal Constitution. It has to be what we're working on today.
So when we hear about bills being proposed in Congress for term limits, you don't believe that's going to be upheld by the courts if it gets appealed?
It won't be upheld if it's a statute, but if it's a constitutional amendment like the one Senator Cruz has introduced, Senate Joint Resolution 1, under Article 5 of the Constitution, if that gets a 2/3 approval from the House and the Senate, then it will go back to the states for ratification, and if 38 states ratify it, then it does become part of the Constitution. Sometimes there are like little clever bills that are sort of dovetail with term limits but don't quite do it. These are serious term limits that Senator Cruz is proposing that would affect every member of Congress, and it is a constitutional amendment, so it can't be challenged in court.
And he'll be talking about it, of course, today. He's chairing that subcommittee hearing that both these gentlemen will be testifying at. Again, now's your chance to talk to him because you can't ask questions later. It's only members of the Senate who will be asking those questions. But John is in Jonesboro, Georgia, on that line for those who support term limits. Good morning.
Good morning.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you for taking my call.
What's your question or comment?
My comment is I oppose the term limits because once they get into power, they become career politicians, and that is no good. Once they become a career politician, all the big interest groups have the money backing them, and they are afraid that if they don't win re-election, they're going to have to get out and find a real job. But then their staffers, they all become what you call lobbyists or so-called lobbyists. So I think that it's time, if you've got a term, except for the presidency, you should have one for Congress.
So, John, what do you think's a fair term for members of the House and Senate?
2 terms, and that's it. 2 terms, and they won't have a chance to build a relationship with the money that's behind them, because in certain districts, and you can go back 20 years, in certain districts, nobody can run against them because they have the funds in front of them.
Casey Burgett, what would you say to John?
The first point about career politicians, I completely get. We have a lot of people, John, you mentioned a bunch of names going back to 1973, which is a long time ago. They are career politicians. One, they only keep that office if members or the electorate sends them back. So it's not given to them. It's not granted. We see upsets all the time. Look no further than 2018. You have to challenge them if you want them. I think more members, if they're afraid to lose their seat, that's a member problem. That is them putting their interests above the electorate. And call me naive, but I think that we have a lot of members that don't put that interest above their constituents. And if you feel that they do, then vote against them. That's the prerogative. That's your duty. That's what we expect in our system of government. And in terms of legislative staff, again, if you force the mandate of them turning over, you're just going to increase the deference on the lobbyists that are able to provide this information, to call them, to seek them out, to pry on new members. Because with any job, any career that you decide, you get better at the job the more that you do the job. It is a learned experience. There's no school for Congress. There's no way to train for this outside of state legislatures. And even then, you're self-selecting into people that have an interest in this. And I don't know what other profession that we kick people out without regard to how supported they are or how effective they are at their job. I think it's something that is worth discussing, but it shouldn't be demonized.
Nick Tomboulides, John says 2 terms total. What is the term limit that Senator Cruz is proposing in his legislation?
Well, let me first say I do agree with John on 2 terms, 1 in office, 1 in prison. But what Senator Cruz's constitutional amendment says is a 3-term limit in the House, 6 years, and a 2-term limit in the Senate. So 6 in the House, 12 in the Senate in terms of how long you'd be able to serve.
And Senators Rick Scott and Mike Braun are pushing a different piece of legislation. I believe theirs is 12 years in the House and 2 in the Senate?
Yeah, we don't support that one. We think 12 is a little too long for members of the House. We feel like if the president can get his job done in 8 years, then members of the House don't need longer than that. In the Senate, of course, you're dealing with a 6-year term, so you have to write it at 12 in order to allow for at least 1 re-election. But I think term limits are like dental appointments. The shorter, the better.
For the Scott and Braun legislation, is that also in the form of a constitutional amendment?
It is, yeah.
So Leonard, in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, opposes term limits. Go ahead.
Hi. Let's face facts. Government is a reflection of us. We put these people in office. Let's remember one very important rule, and that is we hate Congress except for the Congress people we elect. We hate most senators except for the senator we elect. The fact of the matter is that if we want to change government, the first thing we need to do is get gerrymandering out of the political parties and allow for fair congressional districts based on the gains or the losses of a state, not the whims of one political party over another. That's the only way you're going to change government, and to limit politicians to 2 terms in 2 terms in the House and whatever in the Senate, it's idiotic. The fact of the matter is that if you really think that the president completes a job in 8 years, you're sadly mistaken. A president should really have more than 8 years. Personally, I think they should have 3 terms. But unfortunately, not for this particular president. I'd like to see him out as quickly as possible.
Nick Tomboulides.
Yeah, this is about the competitiveness of our elections and whether people really have the chance to make a meaningful choice when they go into the ballot box. Like I mentioned before, even in a so-called wave election, over 80% of the elections for Congress are either uncontested or undercontested. That means for the vast majority of Americans, there is no functional choice. We have to make our elections more competitive to revitalize them. If you look at when elections are competitive, it happens to be when there are open seats. But unfortunately, here in Washington, we only get open seats when a member retires, passes away, or gets indicted, God forbid. Term limits would force mandatory open seat elections on a regular basis, which would give voters a lot more choices at the ballot box. Right now, incumbency is doing more to keep choices off your ballot than term limits is, because no one is willing to run against an incumbent. If you have less than $1 million in your bank account, your odds of beating a House incumbent are 2 in 193. I mean, the odds are terrible. That's why most people wait for an open seat to vie for Congress, but those open seats don't open up as often as they should.
An interesting chart from the Congressional Research Service showing that the average years of prior service in each chamber that senators and representatives have at the start of their term. You can see it creeping up over the years, and this chart, if you can't see the numbers, goes back to 1789. At the beginning of the 116th Congress, members of the House had 8.6 years on average of prior service in the House when they were reelected to their seat. Members of the Senate, 10.1 years of prior service in the Senate. Again, the Congressional Research Service with that chart. Nick Tomboulides, you had talked about a constitutional amendment to change to add term limits. What is a term limit convention?
Okay. So under Article 5 of the Constitution, there are actually two ways to propose an amendment. You can get a 2/3 vote in Congress. We call that the turkeys voting for Thanksgiving method. Or you can actually go back to the state legislatures and get 2/3 of state legislatures to call a convention to propose an amendment. This was inserted by the framers at the Constitutional Convention to give states an end run around Washington, D.C., around the swamp, when Congress refused to do what was right because it wasn't in their own self-interest. So there have been 3 states, Florida, Missouri, and Alabama, that have called for a convention to term limit Congress. There have been 15 that have called for a convention that would include term limiting Congress, along with some other issues like a balanced budget amendment.
If you get a constitutional convention to do that, does that open a Pandora's box of changing the entire Constitution?
No, we're not talking about a constitutional convention. We're talking about a single issue convention to propose a single amendment. If you look at the legislation these states have passed, they all say that this convention is only operative if it focuses on term limits for members of Congress and no other subject. And there are many, many safeguards built into the process to make sure that nothing else can get out of a convention. The biggest safeguard, of course, is that any constitutional amendment in America has to be ratified by 38 state legislatures to become part of the Constitution. So that's why we have a firewall against constitutional amendments. It's why we've only had 27 constitutional amendments in our history, because it's exceptionally hard to do.
Casey Bergen?
It is. It's exceptionally hard to do. I think there's a lot of points talking about using term limits to solve other problems. If you're frustrated at 80% of the seats being safe, term limits will not solve that problem. The same districts will be drawn. It's going to be different people running in the same districts. If you're talking about the scare-off effect of having big money in your pockets when you're running and scaring off challengers, that won't be solved by term limits. In fact, it will open it up for special interests and big money donors to kind of pick and choose their candidates in those safe seats. So it's often painted as the silver bullet, as a previous caller talked about. But if we're frustrated about those other problems, and we should be, we need to solve those problems head on, and kicking good members out at the expense of bad members, or the other way around, then I think that's just a bad mechanism, a draconian mechanism to make that happen.
Nick Tomboulides talked about his work at U.S. term limits. Explain what the R Street Institute is, how you got into this line of work.
The R Street Institute is a think tank here in Washington, D.C. I work on the governance project specifically, which talks about the unsexy issues of making Congress work again, because we agree. Congress is broken. It's serving the wrong people too often of times, but we are not naive to think that this is an easy process, that if you elect just the right members all the time, they're going to do this. We recognize that Congress doesn't have the capacity to govern in our system of governance. Right now, we don't have enough staff who know the right amounts. We are too dependent on outside information. So the R Street Institute, across a host of unsexy issues, we've tried to find experts to drum up the conversation about this, because it's all important.
And with us this morning for about another 15 minutes on the Washington Journal, John has been waiting in Louisiana, supports term limits. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I support them. I'm glad to see the gentleman mentioned the Convention of the States, because I think that's the only way, the Article 5, that we're going to get it, because there's no way the legislatures are going to vote themselves term limits. And I approve of that. I think I don't worry about the Constitution being unnecessarily amended because of the 3/4 requirement by the states. That's the way it was built. The other thing I oppose, is, believe it or not, is the 17th Amendment. I think the Senate should go back to be the governor's house as opposed to the people's house, which was the way the founders put this thing together, where the state houses determine the Senate makeup. And they called that the governor's house as opposed to the people's house of the House of Representatives, which is truly a democratic type thing.
John, can I ask why you support doing it that way, out of curiosity?
Yes, I absolutely do. I support the Convention of States. I think that's the only way to do it.
No, I mean talking about the Senate and your comments about the 17th Amendment. Why do you think it should go back to being the governor's house?
Because it's become a political thing now. It's just like the House of Representatives, I don't think it was ever set that way. It was to be the states get to choose them, the state legislatures.
Any of you gentlemen have thoughts on the 17th Amendment?
Not particularly, but I will mention something that came to mind while he was speaking about that. The 17th Amendment, whether you agree with it or not, is actually good precedent for how to get an amendment passed, because the convention organizing at the state level was actually the genesis of that amendment. At the time it was proposed by Congress, about 30 states had issued applications asking for a convention to debate that subject. Congress saw the writing on the wall, and then they proposed the amendment on themselves. So my only takeaway from that is maybe we can borrow that strategy to get a term limits amendment.
How close do you think we are to Congress seeing the writing on the wall on term limits?
Oh, I think we're getting closer every day. Frustration with Congress is at an all-time high. They're going to have to do something to mollify it and to bring back confidence in this institution. I think American people have lost confidence in Congress. We feel like our politicians overpromise and underdeliver on every single issue. I can't think of a major problem Congress has solved in the last 30 years. And so something is eventually going to have to give, and term limits would go a long way toward convincing people that Congress belongs to the people again.
Casey Burgett?
I couldn't disagree. First of all, I'm pro 17th Amendment. The Senate was intended to be a governor's house, but we have governor's houses. They exist in where governors live in their states. I am pro voters choosing their representatives, and that goes to the Senate. But in terms of solving problems, I don't think it will get better. It's great politics to advance the term limits because Congress is so unpopular. Go ahead.
Is it good politics by a member of Congress to oppose term limits? Does it come across as looking out for their own self-interest?
Yeah, it's horrible politics. It's absolutely horrible politics to say that I deserve my job, I want to keep my job for as long as they have me, but they should emphasize the fact that they are reelected, their name is on the ballot, voters have an option to choose someone else. But yeah, it's great politics to say I should be kicked out, I am part of the problem, I come here, I am frustrated. All those things can be true. But that doesn't mean that it's good for governing, and I advance the argument that it's awful for governing, and we're going to be less likely to solve these horrible problems, these things that affect day-to-day Americans, because it's just going to be a constant turnover of new members that don't know how to do the job.
Nick Tomboulides, how many members of Congress have taken the term limits pledge, and have any of them broken that pledge?
About 60 members of Congress have taken the pledge.
I'm surprised it's that low. I really am.
Well, there are others who support term limits, but a huge problem with it is they all want to go home to their districts and say, I support term limits, but we just couldn't get anything done because we couldn't agree on what the proposal should be. That's why we designed the U.S. Term Limits Pledge, to get all the term limit supporters in Congress on the same page, singing from the same hymnal and supporting the same bill, because that's really the only way that it's going to work. Some of them do it. Some of them sign up for it for cynical reasons, certainly. Others do it from a principled perspective. But every 2 election cycles, we're constantly getting more congressmen on the bill because they never leave.
How many have broken the pledge over the years, and do you call them out publicly when they do that?
There have been a select few who have broken the pledge. Mark Wayne Mullen from Oklahoma is a notable one. He's actually one of the first person who's broken 2 term limits pledges. He broke ours, and he broke the one he made to the people of Oklahoma, saying that he would step down from Congress after 3 terms.
Gloversville, New York is next. Michael, on that line for those who oppose term limits. Good morning.
Thank you. I'd like to thank C-SPAN for the great job you guys do, and I'm a first-time caller. I'd just like to say that, first of all, term limits are a ruse. We have term limits. It's called the vote. The fact is that you don't like that my representative got elected to 5 terms, 10 terms in a row. Well, run against him. That comes down to the next problem, money. Money is the root of all these problems. Both gentlemen have talked about the fact that money influences everything. You want to change the system, take the money out of it. That's the first thing you do. The second is gerrymandering. People are able to stay in their districts because of the way they're gerrymandered. And that's the problem that needs to be solved. Term limits is an easy campaign issue. It sounds good, but it doesn't solve the problem.
Nick Tomboulides, I'll let you start on that one.
Well, if you want to vote in competitive, meaningful elections, you do need term limits. What we've seen at the state level is the states that have adopted term limits have seen record numbers of candidates filing for office because when you have open seats and you have incumbents who haven't been there 20 and 30 years, you have a better chance of winning that election. It's not like pulling a sword from a stone. Right now, there is a tremendous imbalance in the amount of money an incumbent is able to raise versus what a challenger can raise. It's about 9-to-1 from special interest PACs, because special interests and lobbyists love to bet on winners. And so they're just perpetuating this cycle of incumbency. A lot of people don't even run against these incumbents. They don't bother. They wait for the open seat because that's the only time there's real competition. And by the way, in an open seat, it doesn't cost as much to run for Congress. Seats are a lot cheaper, so the barriers to entry are lower. That means people from all walks of life might have an opportunity to serve in Congress, and we would get a legislature that really looks like our citizenry.
Casey Burgett, I know you're going to oppose term limits, but how do you solve some of those money in politics issues that Nick Tomboulides brings up?
Yeah, but notice it's a totally different conversation. It will not change term limits will not change the district boundaries. It may open it up for more seats, but solving money in politics, that's an infinitely complex issue, and there's a lot of things that we can do, but it's going to go up to the Supreme Court. We've seen that with the Citizens United case. There's soft limits, there's hard limits, there's a whole host of ways to donate and bundle to a candidate, often to incumbents, but I think it's naive to think that those big money donors will all of a sudden sit out races when they can't choose the incumbent. I think that they're going to pick and choose which ones they think are most likely to serve their interests, because that is what their money is going towards. And I don't think that it's an incumbent thing. I think that relationship is valuable because it's a known commodity. I don't think that money will sit out, and I don't think it will become any less impactful with term limits. What we need to do is tackle that issue separately of term limits, because they are fundamentally different things.
Just a couple minutes left in today's Washington Journal. You want to respond?
Yeah, even if you solve the problem with money, incumbents still have a whole host of non-monetary advantages that they can exploit to keep their seats. For example, they've got tremendous name recognition. They've got the Congressional franking privilege, which basically says they can send taxpayer-funded election-style mailers to their constituents at no cost. No challenger is afforded that opportunity. It really helps incumbents to stack the deck. And you also see that incumbents basically get free media campaigns. Anytime an incumbent puts out a press release, starts a new initiative, that's going to be in the local newspaper, that's going to be on TV, it's going to be on cable news, and it's this perpetuated cycle of advantages that just cannot be overcome, even by a very good candidate. I'll give you an example. Barack Obama is one of the most talented, gifted, charismatic politicians in the history of our country. When he ran for Congress in 2000 against an incumbent, he got wiped out by Bobby Rush. So if Barack Obama, if a politician that talented cannot overcome the advantages of incumbency, then nobody can.
Just a couple of minutes left this morning. Joel has been waiting in Eagle, Idaho. Good morning on that line for those who support term limits.
Hi. Hey, first of all, Barack Obama couldn't run a lemonade stand. His experience in the executive branch was zero. I think that the guy from Louisiana who called in about the 17th Amendment, I would like to hear greater discussion of that. What I'm hearing in this discussion this morning is an undercurrent of too much power in Washington. And before 1913, we had a election of senators by state legislatures, and that essentially gave states more power. What has happened after the 17th Amendment was passed in 1913 is the power shifted to the federal level. So you talk about money corruption, look at that. And I'd appreciate some comment on that. Thanks.
Casey Burgett, you want to start?
I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on the 17th Amendment. I am of the position that voters should have the right to choose their elected officials, and that extends to the Senate. Before 1913, women couldn't vote either. I think this is a progress of us developing as a country, and we're not done. And I think that we should continue that discussion. But to give it back to governors that are second degree elected to their senators, I think that's just a bad way to represent constituents.
Nick Tomboulides?
Don't really have any particular thoughts on the 17th Amendment. I mean, I can see the merits of both sides. I know that before the 17th Amendment, there were a lot of issues with state legislators being bribed, for example, to anoint certain senators to those positions. But at the same time, I also see the other side of the argument that right now the states are getting short shrift with respect to their influence in Washington, D.C., and perhaps you'd have fewer unfunded mandates. I think it's a complicated issue. I'm more of a term limits guy. That's my focus.
you've been a term limits guy and explained your position throughout this segment. Has there ever been a member of Congress that you wish has stuck around longer?
There have been quite a few. And I'm not going to name any of them right now. But I think the fact that you have a good member of Congress among 535 members is not necessarily a justification for allowing career politicians to run our government. Because typically when you have a member of Congress who is doing a good job, that person has to buck their party. They have to buck the establishment. They don't simply toe the party line. And that kind of resistance in Congress is met with retaliation. If you're an independent thinking member of Congress, you'll be pulled off your committees. You'll have less influence in this body. And so most of the congressmen that I like tend to be pushed to the back bench here by the leadership. If we had term limits, this system would not be governed by how many gray hairs you have on your head. It would not be governed by how long you've sat in that chair. It would be a merit-based system because it would have to be.
Try to get one more call in. Gloria's been waiting in Monroe, Washington. Good morning.
Good morning. I think Nick is wonderful. I think he's a smart, bright young man, and we need more people like that running our country. I think there should be term limits. I think 8 years for a president, maybe, 20 years for a senator, and no more than 20 years for a congressperson. And we do have serious problems going on, and the majority of the public want it done and over with and want them out. And that is a fact.
Thanks for the call from Washington.
I swear I didn't pay her to say that.
I think he's great and wonderful, handsome too. I support the call.
Your thoughts heading into this hearing today at 3:30, and what kind of support or pushback you're going to get from the senators on the panel?
Yeah, I can't imagine that Senator Cruz and I are on the same side of the issue, given that he introduced this amendment. But I'm looking forward to this discussion. I write on government reform, and usually the things that I write about get very few eyeballs because it's not a sexy topic. But this is one. This is the issue that I hear most about. So I'm interested and excited about the opportunity to discuss the pros and cons of these things, because with something that has 85% approval across America, I think a lot of them we're overselling the benefits of term limits, and I think the conversation needs to take place that there are actual downsides to this, and they often don't get the thrift in the politics of advancing something like this. So I'm excited about it.
Nick Tomboulides, your thoughts on Laird today?
We'll see. Politicians don't tend to like term limits. That's why I love it so much. But it's an issue the American people deserve to have debated in this city. It's been so long since there's been a committee hearing on term limits, despite all of the polling. What a lot of people don't know about this issue is it's not just the most popular issue in America. It's also the most bipartisan issue in America. 82% overall support, but that includes 89% of Republicans, 76% of Democrats, and 83% of independents. This is the only issue that Donald Trump and Barack Obama agree on. The only people who oppose this issue are the permanent political class in Washington, and they oppose it for self-serving reasons. I think we, as the American people, need to overcome that self-interest and make this happen.
The conversation continues at 3:30 p.m. in room 226 of the Dirksen Senate Office Building. It's the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee hearing on keeping Congress accountable, term limits in the United States. You'll see both our guests at that hearing. Casey Burgett is a senior fellow in the Governance Project at the R Street Institute. Nick Tomboulides is executive director of U.S. Term Limits. We appreciate both your time this morning.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
And that's going to do it for our program today, but we'll, of course, be back here tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. Eastern, 4 a.m. Pacific. In the meantime, have a great Tuesday.